Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive.
It's great to be here.
Today we're going to be looking at the Cyrus cylinder.
Ooh, that's a good one.
Yeah, this one was requested by a listener.
Oh,
So we're going to be looking at the Cyrus cylinder, and I guess the first question is, what is it?
well, it's about a foot long and made of clay.
Okay.
And it's covered in cuneiform writing.
Cuneiform, that's the wedge-shaped stuff, right?
That's not, yeah, like little triangles pressed into clay tablets.
Oh, this is like a tablet.
It's cylindrical.
Okay, so it's round.
Yeah, it's like a cylinder shape.
I see.
And it was found broken, actually, suggesting that there might be other copies out there, which is really interesting.
Wow, so there could be more than one Cyrus cylinder.
Yeah, potentially.
That's amazing. Okay, so we've got this clay cylinder covered in cuneiform, and what does it say?
Well, this is where things get really interesting.
Okay.
It basically tells the story of how Cyrus the Great, this Persian king, conquered Babylon in 539 BC.
Okay, Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon.
Got it. But it's not your typical, victor's tale.
What do you mean?
Well, it's very carefully crafted to present Cyrus in a positive light, you see.
So it's not just a straightforward historical.
Yeah, at all. It's more like a piece of propaganda, almost like a press release from ancient times.
A press release etched in clay. That's fascinating.
It is. And to understand why it's written this way, you need to understand the context of what was happening in Babylon at the time.
Okay, so set the scene for us. What was going on in Babylon before Cyrus came along?
Well, the reigning king Nabonidus wasn't exactly the most popular guy.
Really? How come?
He developed this obsession with the moon god, Sin.
Sin. Like the bad thing?
No, Sin, S-I-N. It was a moon god.
Oh, moon god.
And he was so focused on Sin that he neglected the traditional Babylonian god, Marduk.
And that didn't go over well with the people?
Not at all. Marduk was like the top god in the Babylonian pantheon. Neglecting him was a big no-no.
So Nabonidus is already on shaky ground religiously, and then what?
Well, then he does something even more unpopular. He decides to ditch Babylon altogether.
He just left?
Pretty much. He went off to Arabia to build a fancy new temple for Sin, leaving his son in charge.
Talk about a PR nightmare. You abandoned your main city and your chief god.
Exactly. It created this perfect storm of religious tension and political instability.
And I'm guessing Cyrus saw an opportunity here.
Oh, absolutely. He was a very shrewd leader. He realized that he could use this situation to his advantage.
So instead of just brute force, he played it smart.
Exactly. And that's where the Cyrus cylinder comes in.
Okay, so how does the cylinder fit into all of this?
Well, the cylinder basically spins this whole narrative about how Marduk was so fed up with Nabonidus that he personally chose Cyrus to restore order to Babylon.
So Cyrus is like the chosen one.
Exactly. He's presented as a savior, a divinely appointed leader who's going to set things right.
Yeah, I'm guessing Nabonidus doesn't come off looking so good in this story.
Not at all. The cylinder portrays him as a terrible ruler who upset the gods and abandoned his people.
So it's like a PR smear campaign in clay.
Pretty much Cyrus knew how to control the narrative even back then.
Wow, so the Cyrus cylinder is more than just a historical record. It's a carefully crafted piece of propaganda designed to legitimize Cyrus's rule.
Exactly. It's a fascinating example of how, even in ancient times, leaders understood the power of shaping public perception.
So is that all there is to it? Was Cyrus just a master manipulator?
Well, that's a question we'll be exploring in more depth as we delve further into this deep dive.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Let's take a closer look at some of the specific claims made in the cylinder and see if we can separate the spin from the reality.
Sounds good. Let's do it.
All right, so the cylinder goes on to highlight all these great things that Cyrus did for Babylon.
Like what?
Well, for example, it talks about how he restored temples.
Okay, so he was trying to win over the religious folks.
Exactly. He was showing respect for their beliefs,
Yeah.
even though he was a foreigner and a conqueror.
Smart move. And what else?
It also mentions that he allowed displaced people to return to their homelands.
So he was being all compassionate and merciful.
On the surface, yes. But there could have been strategic reasons for that as well.
Like what?
Well, by allowing people to return home, he could have been trying to stabilize the empire.
I see. Happy people are less likely to rebel.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got the temple restoration, the repatriation of people. Anything else?
The cylinder also emphasizes Cyrus's respect for Babylonian traditions.
He wasn't trying to force his own culture on them.
Not at all. He seems to have understood the importance of appealing to local customs and beliefs.
So he was a bit of a cultural chameleon.
You could say that he was very adaptable and politically savvy.
It's amazing how much we can learn about ancient politics from this one little piece of clay.
It really is. It's like a window into the past.
So was Cyrus a genuinely benevolent ruler? or just a master manipulator? What's the verdict?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, and to answer it, we need to look beyond the Cyrus cylinder itself.
Okay, so what other sources do we have?
Well, we have accounts from other ancient writers, including Greek historians who wrote about Cyrus.
And what do they say?
They paint a somewhat mixed picture of him.
You mean?
Some portray him as a wise and just ruler, while others focus on his military conquests and his ambition.
So it's not a simple black and white situation.
Not at all. Like most historical figures, Cyrus was a complex individual with both positive and negative qualities.
I see. So we need to take all these different sources into account and try to piece together a balanced view of him.
Exactly. It's like solving a historical puzzle.
I'm up for the challenge.
Mhm.
So where do we go from here?
Well, I think the next step is to delve deeper into some of these other sources and see what they can tell us about Cyrus and his reign.
Sounds good. I'm ready to keep digging.
Excellent. Then let's continue our deep dive.
Okay, so let's talk about these other sources. What do they tell us about Cyrus?
Well, one of the most interesting things is that they reveal a different side to him.
Different from the Cyrus we see in the cylinder.
Exactly. The cylinder presents him as this sort of almost saintly figure chosen by the gods to rule.
Yeah, very PR friendly.
But these other sources show that he was also a ruthless conqueror who wasn't afraid to use force to achieve his goals.
So he wasn't all sunshine and rainbows.
Not exactly. He was a pragmatist who understood that power sometimes requires tough decisions.
That makes sense. I mean, he built a vast empire.
Yeah,
He couldn't have done that by being nice all the time.
exactly. He had to be strategic, and sometimes that meant making difficult choices.
So it's a more nuanced picture than the one we get from the cylinder.
Absolutely. It's important to remember that history is rarely black and white. It's full of shades of gray.
And conflicting perspectives.
Precisely. Different sources will often present different versions of events depending on their own biases and agendas.
So how do we sort through all that and get to the truth?
Well, we have to be critical thinkers. We have to examine the evidence carefully and consider the context in which it was created.
So it's like being a detective.
Exactly. We have to gather all the clues, weigh them against each other, and try to reconstruct the most plausible story.
That sounds like a lot of work.
It can be, but it's also incredibly rewarding. There's nothing quite like uncovering the hidden truths of the past.
I can see why you're so passionate about history.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about the Cyrus cylinder and we've talked about these other ancient sources.
Yeah.
But what about modern interpretations of Cyrus? How is he viewed today?
That's a great question, and it's one that's been the subject of much debate.
How so?
Well, Cyrus has been hailed by some as a kind of proto-human rights advocate.
Really? Because of the stuff in the cylinder about religious freedom and repatriation.
Exactly. Some people see those passages as evidence that he was ahead of his time in terms of his respect for individual liberties.
That's interesting. But I'm guessing not everyone agrees with that interpretation.
You're right. There are others who argue that we're projecting modern values onto an ancient figure. They say that the concept of human rights as we understand it simply didn't exist in the ancient world.
So Cyrus wasn't some kind of enlightened humanitarian.
Not necessarily. He was a product of his time, and his actions were likely motivated by a complex mix of political, religious, and personal factors.
We need to be careful about reading too much into his actions.
Exactly. We shouldn't try to force him into a modern mold. He was a man of his own era with his own set of beliefs and values.
That makes sense. So how should we view him then?
I think the best approach is to try to understand him in his own context, to see him as a complex and multifaceted figure who both reflected and shaped his times.
That sounds like a good approach. It's always tempting to judge historical figures by our own standards, but it's important to remember that they lived in very different worlds.
Exactly. And by understanding their worlds, we can gain a deeper appreciation for the complexities of history.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this Cyrus cylinder is more than just a piece of clay. It's a gateway to a whole world of history and ideas.
That's exactly right. It's a reminder that the past is never truly past. It continues to shape our present in countless ways.
And that there's always more to learn.
Absolutely. The journey of discovery never ends.
Okay, I'm hooked. I want to learn more about Cyrus and his empire. Where should I start?
Well, there are some great books and articles available.
Any recommendations?
Let me see. I have a few in mind. I can send you the links later.
Perfect. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so before we wrap up, is there anything else you want to add about the Cyrus cylinder?
Just that it's a truly remarkable artifact. It's a testament to the ingenuity and artistry of the ancient world, and it continues to fascinate and intrigue us thousands of years later.
Well said. It's amazing how something so small can have such a big impact.
It is. It's a reminder that the past is full of surprises, and that there's always something new to discover.
Well, I'm definitely looking forward to uncovering more of those surprises. And I'm sure our listeners are too. So until next time, keep exploring and keep those curiosity fires burning.
Absolutely. The journey of discovery is what makes life so exciting.
And on that note, we'll sign off for today. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive into history.
It's been a pleasure.
We'll see you next time.
Until then, keep those minds engaged.
And keep asking those questions.
Absolutely. The more you learn, the more you realize how much there is still to know.
So true. Okay, that's a wrap, folks. Thanks for listening.
And happy exploring.
See you next time. So it sounds like Cyrus was pretty good at PR even back then.
Oh yeah, he was a master of it.
But was it all just spin?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it?
Was he really this benevolent liberator? Or was it all just a clever act to secure his power?
It's hard to say for sure. After all, we're talking about events that happened over 2,500 years ago.
Yeah, and we're relying on sources that could be biased or incomplete.
Exactly. But I think it's worth digging a little deeper and looking at some of the specific claims made in the Cyrus cylinder.
Okay, so let's break it down. What are some of the key things the cylinder highlights about Cyrus's rule?
Well, one of the things that's often mentioned is his policy of religious tolerance.
Right, I remember that part. He allowed people to worship their own gods.
Exactly. And this was a pretty big deal at the time.
How come?
Well, in the ancient world, it was common for conquerors to impose their own gods on the people they conquered.
Like you're part of our empire now, so you worship our gods kind of thing.
Precisely. But Cyrus took a different approach. He allowed the Babylonians to continue worshiping their own deities.
So he was basically saying, you do you.
Yeah, pretty much. And this would have earned him a lot of goodwill among the local population.
Makes sense.
But
So religious tolerance was one of his big selling points.
it certainly seems that way.
Okay, so what else does the cylinder tell us about Cyrus's policies?
Well, another key aspect is his focus on repatriation,
Repatriation meaning?
allowing people who had been displaced to return to their homelands.
Oh, right, like the Jews who had been exiled to Babylon?
Exactly. The cylinder talks about Cyrus allowing various groups of people to go back home and rebuild their shrines.
So he was basically undoing the forced migrations of previous empires.
In a sense, yes.
And this was seen as a very benevolent act.
Oh, absolutely. It would have been hugely popular among those who had been forced to leave their homes.
Yeah, I can imagine. It's one thing to conquer a city, but it's another thing to actually win over the hearts and minds of the people.
Exactly. And that seems to have been Cyrus's goal. He wanted to create a stable and unified empire, and he knew that he couldn't do that through force alone.
He needed to get people on his side.
Precisely. And his policies of religious tolerance and repatriation were key to achieving that.
So he was a clever politician as well as a military leader.
Oh, absolutely. He was a master strategist both on and off the battlefield.
Okay, so we've got the religious tolerance, the repatriation, anything else?
Well, the cylinder also emphasizes Cyrus's respect for Babylonian culture and traditions.
So he wasn't just trying to erase their identity and impose his own.
Not at all. He seems to have recognized the importance of preserving local customs and beliefs.
So he was kind of like a cultural preservationist.
In a way, yes. He understood that a strong empire is built on a foundation of diversity and respect.
That's a pretty enlightened view for an ancient ruler.
It is. It suggests that he was more than just a conqueror. He was a visionary leader who saw the value in creating a multi-ethnic and multi-religious society.
Wow. So the Cyrus cylinder is painting a pretty rosy picture of this guy.
It is. But as with any historical source, we need to be careful about taking it at face value.
Right, because there could be some bias there.
Exactly. The cylinder was written by Cyrus's own people, so it's natural that they would want to present him in the best possible light.
Makes sense. It's like reading a politician's autobiography. You're not going to get the whole story.
Precisely. So we need to consider other sources as well and try to piece together a more complete picture.
Okay, so what do these other sources tell us?
Well, they provide some interesting insights into Cyrus's character and motivations.
Like what?
For example, some ancient historians describe him as being very charismatic and persuasive.
So he had that it factor.
Yeah, he seems to have had a natural ability to win people over.
Which would have been very useful for a leader who was trying to build a vast empire.
Absolutely. He needed to be able to inspire loyalty and trust among his followers.
And it sounds like he was good at that.
He certainly seems to have been a very effective leader.
Okay, so charisma and persuasion were two of his strengths. What else?
Well, some sources also suggest that he was a very shrewd judge of character.
Meaning?
He was able to surround himself with talented and loyal advisors.
So he knew how to delegate and build a strong team.
Exactly. He understood that he couldn't do everything himself. He needed to rely on the skills and expertise of others.
That's a sign of a good leader.
It is. It shows that he was willing to trust and empower those around him.
Okay, so we're getting a more nuanced picture of Cyrus now. He was a skilled military leader, a clever politician, a charismatic figure, and a shrewd judge of character.
That's a pretty impressive resume.
It is. But it's also important to remember that he was a product of his time.
Right, we can't judge him by modern standards.
Exactly. So while we can admire his achievements, we also need to acknowledge the complexities of his legacy.
Precisely. History is rarely black and white. It's full of shades of gray.
And that's what makes it so fascinating.
Absolutely. The more you learn, the more you realize how much you don't know.
Well, I'm definitely learning a lot today, and I'm sure our listeners are too.
I hope so. The Cyrus cylinder is a great example of how a single artifact can open up a whole world of history and ideas.
And how those ideas can still be relevant today.
Exactly. The questions that Cyrus grappled with, the challenges he faced, the choices he made, they all resonate with us in some way.
Because at the end of the day, we're all trying to figure out how to build a better world.
That's right. And by studying the past, we can gain insights that can help us navigate the present and the future.
So the Cyrus cylinder isn't just a dusty old relic. It's a source of wisdom and inspiration.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that even though times change, the fundamental questions of human existence remain the same.
That's a powerful thought.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have. We've explored the history of the Cyrus cylinder. We've looked at its key messages. We've considered different interpretations. We've even delved into the character of Cyrus himself.
But I have a feeling this conversation isn't over yet.
You're right. There's always more to discover. There are always new questions to ask. There are always new perspectives to consider.
So the deep dive continues.
Absolutely. The journey of exploration never ends.
And that's what makes it so exciting.
Exactly. So let's keep digging, let's keep learning, and let's keep those curiosity fires burning.
Well said. I'm ready for more.
Excellent. Then let's continue our deep dive.
And you know what's really fascinating about all this?
What's that?
It's how the meaning of the Cyrus cylinder has kind of evolved over time.
Oh, yeah, totally. I mean, think about it. This thing was buried in the foundations of a temple in ancient Babylon.
Right.
It was meant for the gods to read it, right? Or at least that's what we think.
But now it's on display in the British Museum.
Exactly. And it's been hailed as this, charter of human rights.
Which is a pretty big jump from appealing to the gods.
It is. And it shows how objects from the past can take on new meanings in the present.
It's like the cylinder is speaking to us across the centuries.
In a way, yes. It's challenging us to think about our own values and how they relate to the past.
It's making us question what we think we know about history.
Exactly. And that's one of the things I love about history. It's always evolving. It's never static.
So we're not just learning about the past, we're also learning about ourselves.
That's right. History is a mirror. It reflects back our own beliefs and biases.
It helps us see the world in a new light.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to keep studying history, to keep asking questions, to keep challenging our assumptions.
Because the more we learn about the past, the better equipped we are to navigate the present and the future.
Absolutely. History is our guide. It can teach us so much about who we are, where we've come from, and where we're going.
So the Cyrus cylinder is more than just an ancient artifact. It's a source of wisdom and inspiration.
It is. It's a reminder that even though times change, the human condition remains fundamentally the same.
We're still grappling with the same issues of power, justice, and freedom.
Exactly. And that's why the story of Cyrus and the Cyrus cylinder continues to resonate with us today.
Okay, I think we've done a pretty good job of unpacking this one.
I think so. We've covered a lot of ground.
But before we wrap up, is there anything else you want to add?
Just that I think the Cyrus cylinder is a great example of how history is never truly finished.
How so?
Well, new discoveries are always being made, new interpretations are always emerging, and our understanding of the past is constantly evolving.
So it's like a never-ending story.
It is, and that's what makes it so exciting.
There's always something more to learn.
Absolutely. And that's why I encourage everyone to keep exploring history, to keep digging, to keep asking questions.
Because you never know what you might find.
Exactly. The past is full of surprises.
And on that note, I think we'll wrap things up for today.
Sounds good.
Thanks for joining us for another deep dive into history.
It's been a pleasure as always.
And until next time, keep those curiosity fires burning.
And keep exploring the past. It's an amazing journey.
Absolutely. Okay, folks, that's a wrap. Thanks for listening.
And happy exploring, everyone.